Kicked out at 19, she built a home inside a ruined church. Reverend Brant, who had buried 11 settlers in 14 Nebraska winters, said, "You'll freeze by Christmas, and God help anyone who shelters with you." She had $7.40, no one, and no shelter she could build. On January 12, 1888, the temperature fell 48 degrees in a single hour. But 5 months earlier, Clara Engel had never driven a nail straight, never spent a night alone, and never once built anything that had to hold against the plains winter to keep her alive. The Church Council of Bethel met on a Tuesday evening in late August of 1887. 7 men sat behind a single long table in the community hall. Reverend Heinrich Brandt at the center, the others flanking him like a row of fence posts. Clara stood across from them. Her mother had been dead 9 weeks. She had stood before this council twice before. Both times she had listened to Brandt read the Apostles' Creed. Both times she had stayed silent. This was the 3rd time. Brandt was 58 years old. He had come to Nebraska Territory in 1874, the year the grasshoppers ate every living thing between the Missouri River and the Rockies. He had buried his first parishioner the following winter, then a second, then a family of 4 in 1881, when the hard winter locked the plains under 6 feet of snow and temperatures fell to 50 degrees below zero. He had buried 11 people in 13 years. He knew what this land did to the unprepared. He read the creed again, slowly, and waited. Clara said, "I buried my mother with these hands. Do not tell me what I believe." The vote was unanimous. She walked out of the community hall into the August heat with $7.40 in her coat pocket, her mother's savings, the whole of it. She had the clothes on her back, a wool blanket, her father's stonemason's hammer, and a cast-iron skillet. The congregation that had been her entire world since the age of 8, the community that had raised her, fed her, sheltered her through the death of her father and the death of her mother, closed its door behind her and did not look out the window. On the treeless Nebraska plains in 1887, that was not a social consequence. It was a death sentence. The church was not simply a spiritual institution on the frontier. It was the structure underneath everything else. The mutual aid network that loaned tools, shared labor, pooled grain stores, and opened doors during storms. Without it, a settler could not borrow a breaking plow, could not call on neighbors at harvest, could not shelter in a neighbor's root cellar when temperatures plummeted. Clara had no family within 300 miles. She had no money to speak of. She was 19 years old and winter would come in 10 weeks. She needed to survive 6 months on the open plains. The math was simple and brutal. A sod house, the cheapest shelter available, cost roughly $20 in materials and required 2 weeks of labor plus a breaking plow worth $10 to $25 to rent or buy. She had neither. A proper timber cabin cost $200 at minimum, and there was almost no timber on the central Nebraska plains. The cottonwood groves along the river bottom yielded thin, soft wood barely suited for fence posts. The price list at Deacon Voss's general store told the rest of the story. 80 pounds of flour cost $3.60. 30 pounds of salt pork ran another $2.40. A cast-iron stove, even a battered second-hand box stove, cost $10. She needed 4 to 6 cords of fuel to heat a small cabin through winter, and fuel had to be gathered by hand from twisted hay and dried cow chips because wood on the open plains was nearly impossible to find in usable quantities. Total minimum to survive until spring, somewhere between $75 and $100. She had $7.40. The gap was not close. It was not almost manageable. It was the difference between standing on solid ground and standing over a hole. Brant watched her go and said nothing. But 3 days later, he walked the quarter-mile to where she had pitched her blanket against a fence line at the edge of the settlement and made his verdict plain. He was not a cruel man. Clara would think about that later. He had seen too many deaths to carry cruelty. What he carried instead was arithmetic. He stood at the fence line and looked at her blanket and her skillet and her father's hammer, and he said what he believed. You have no tools, no shelter, no help, and no time. 60% of settlers with full resources and a full community fail their first winter on these plains. You have none of those things. He paused. That girl will be a frozen corpse by Christmas, and any soul fool enough to help her will answer to God and to me for the waste. He offered her one alternative. Repent, rejoin the congregation. Live through the winter in Agnes Muller's root cellar, crowded and cold, but alive. Clara looked at the prairie stretching west. She looked at the limestone walls rising from the bluff above the river, half a mile away, the burned-out shell of the old Calvary Mission Chapel, roofless since 1881, abandoned since before that. She had walked past those walls 100 times. She had never thought about them the way she was thinking about them now. She told Brant no. He walked back to the settlement. She picked up her hammer and walked toward the ruin. The Calvary Mission Chapel had been built in 1873 by a Congregationalist mission that believed Nebraska territory needed saving. They had quarried limestone from the bluff, cut it by hand into blocks 2.5 feet thick, and raised walls 18 to 22 feet high, enclosing a nave 40 feet long and 22 feet wide. The mission failed in 1876 when the money ran out and the congregation scattered. The roof, timber rafters, and hand-split shingles burned in a prairie fire in 1881. By 1887, the building was a shell, roofless stone walls, grass growing between the mortar joints, 6 narrow lancet window openings open to the sky, and a dirt floor inside covered in charred timber and 6 years of blown-in prairie debris. Clara stepped through the gap where the doors had once hung. The wind died. Outside, the August afternoon was blowing 15 miles per hour out of the southwest, a mild day by Nebraska standards, barely enough to lift dust. Inside the stone walls, there was almost no wind at all. The air sat still. The charred debris on the floor was covered in fine prairie grass that had seeded itself and grown undisturbed, year after year, sheltered from the cutting plane's gusts. A monarch butterfly, orange and black against the gray stone, moved without urgency between the window openings. Clara stood for a long time. She had watched her father work limestone for 7 years. He had been a stonemason in the Volga German settlements before he came to Nebraska, and he had carried that knowledge across the ocean and across the continent, and he had placed his hand on finished stone and told her, "It holds what you give it. Heat stone long enough, and the cold cannot take the warmth back quickly. The stone resists." She knelt and pressed both palms flat against the interior face of the north wall. The stone was warm from the day's sun. She held still and counted to 60. The stone was still warm. She looked at the walls. She looked at the nave floor. She looked at the charred roof beams and the debris pile, some of them burned only on the outside, sound at the core. She began to calculate. Not a cabin on the open prairie, a cabin inside the walls. Small, 10 feet by 12, the minimum size that counted as a legal dwelling under the Homestead Act. Sod walls 1.5 feet thick inside a cottonwood pole frame, roofed with willow branches and packed earth. Not one set of walls between her and the wind, but 3. The sod and timber cabin walls, then a gap of dead still air, then 2.5 feet of solid limestone. She would pack the gap with straw. She would build a low sod wall across the chapel's open doorway to kill the wind's entry into the nave entirely. The stone walls would not insulate. Stone was poor insulation, she knew that, but they would shield. They would stop the wind before it reached her cabin walls, and without wind, the cold was only cold. Cold alone she could fight with a fire. She gathered sticks and built a small fire against the interior wall. She watched the smoke rise straight up through the roofless nave into the open sky. She put her hand near the stone where the fire had burned for 20 minutes. The limestone was noticeably warmer than the air around it. Her father's voice came back to her. "It holds what you give it." She sat in the dirt with the dead fire smoking and worked the numbers. A 10 by 12 cabin held 120 square feet. Agnes Muller's sod house, a structure Clara had helped clean once, years ago, held roughly 220 square feet. A smaller space required 40 to 50% less fuel to heat to the same temperature. If she also eliminated wind, the real killer, the thing that stripped heat out of a building the way it stripped heat out of a body, she might survive the winter on 2 cords of mixed fuel instead of 5. 2 cords she could gather herself with enough weeks of work. 5 cords was impossible alone. It might work. It was the only thing that might work. The risk was total. Every day she spent building inside the ruin was a day not spent on conventional preparations. If the theory was wrong, she would enter winter with an unproven shelter and no time to build anything else. She would die exactly where Brant said she would die, and she would have built her own coffin in the process. She looked at the walls. She looked at the charred beams. She looked at the still air inside the nave, where the butterfly had found it calm enough to rest. She started pulling charred boards off the debris pile. Agnes Muller found her there 4 days later. Agnes was 34 years old and had survived 7 Nebraska winters alone after her husband died of a ruptured appendix in 1880. She had built her own sod house by hand 3 miles south of Bethel with 2 small children underfoot, and she had not lost a single winter yet. She was not a gossip, and she was not cruel, but she was practical in the way that only the prairie could make a person practical, which meant she looked at problems directly and said what she saw. She stood inside the stone walls and watched Clara dragging a charred beam across the dirt floor, and she said, "Stone doesn't keep you warm, girl. Stone keeps you cold. Build inside those walls, and you've built yourself a tomb with a nice view of the sky." Clara set the beam down. "The stone isn't the wall," she said. "The stone is the shield." Agnes looked at the limestone. She pressed her own hand against it, pulled it away quickly the way a person does when something surprises them. The stone was warm from the afternoon sun. She crossed her arms. "I've lived inside sod walls for 7 winters. Sod keeps the warmth in. What you're describing, putting a sod cabin inside a stone box, I've never seen it done. Never heard of it being done?" "Neither have I," Clara said. "That should worry you more than it seems to." "The air is still in here," Clara said. "Feel it." Agnes stood for a moment. The afternoon wind outside the walls was gusting and fading, the steady percussion of the plains. Inside the nave, the air barely moved. Agnes looked at the grass growing undisturbed on the chapel floor. She looked at the charred debris that had fallen straight down, not blown to one side. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You've never built anything." "I watched my father build for 7 years. Watching isn't doing." "No," Clara said, "it isn't." She picked up the beam and went back to work. Agnes watched for a few more minutes, then left without another word. She did not tell the congregation what she had seen, but that night she lay awake thinking about the still air inside the stone walls, and she did not sleep well. Deacon Karl Voss came 10 days later, and he did not come to warn her. Voss was 45 and had owned the Bethel General Store for 6 years. He was a church elder and the settlement's de facto banker. the man who extended credit when stores ran short and collected debts when they could be paid. He was not a poor man by frontier standards, and he did not intend to become poorer. For 2 years he had been petitioning the county land office to allow the congregation to salvage the Calvary Mission Chapel's limestone. The blocks were good stone, hand-cut and well laid. A new church building for Bethel would cost less than half the going rate if the material was already free and on site. Clara Engel sitting in the ruins, hammering and stacking and showing no intention of leaving, was costing him that stone. He walked to the ruin on a morning in early October. Clara was on the roof of her half-framed cabin, laying willow branches across cottonwood rafters. He did not offer to help her down. He waited for her to climb down herself, and then he said, "Those stones belong to God's people, not to a girl who spat in God's face. When winter takes her, and it will, we'll put those stones to righteous use." "They're not your stones," Clara said. "The congregation built that church." "The congregation abandoned it 11 years ago. The county land office doesn't record it as anyone's property. I checked." Voss smiled in a way that was not a smile. "A girl with $7 filing a homestead claim. That costs $14, last I heard." $12.40, Clara said. "I've been taking in laundry." She had been. 3 days a week she walked 5 miles to North Loop and washed other families' clothes for 50 cents a day. It was not enough to build a cabin and stock food and gather fuel, but it was enough to pay the filing fee and have coins left over. She had filed the homestead claim the week before, 160 acres including the quarter section that held the chapel ruin. Voss's expression changed. He looked at the limestone walls, and then at Clara, and then at the walls again. He said, "You're going to die in there." "Maybe," Clara said, "but you won't have the stone." He left. 2 days later, he filed a formal objection with the county land office, citing Clara's age. She was 19, below the standard threshold of 21 for single women. The county land office wrote back in 3 weeks. The objection was denied. As an orphan heading her own household, Clara was eligible to file regardless of age. It was documented law. Voss did not speak to her again before the storm, but word spread through Bethel the way word always spread, and the settlement closed around its judgment. When Clara walked through town for laundry work, women crossed to the other side of the road. Men found reasons to look elsewhere. No one sold her materials. No one offered tools. What she did not see, the 14-year-old son of the Rademacher family, Tobias, leaving items at the chapel entrance in the mornings before she woke. A handful of nails, a jar of lard, half a ball of twine. He never knocked. He never spoke. She never acknowledged the gifts out loud, but she used everyone. October moved into November, and the temperature began to drop. The cabin frame went up in the second week of October. Clara had never used a cross-cut saw before this month. The learning was visible on her hands, blisters that opened and healed and opened again, the skin raw and then hardened and then cut open by the saw's handle in a new place. She worked through it. There was no other option that led to spring. She positioned the frame against the interior north wall of the nave, which was the thickest section of limestone and sat between her and the prevailing northwest winter wind. The frame was cottonwood poles lashed at the corners with rawhide cut from a hide she had traded 4 days of labor to acquire from a passing hunter. 4 uprights, a ridge beam, cross rafters at 18-inch spacing. It took 9 days to raise the frame, working alone from first light until she could no longer see. The walls went up in the 3rd week. She cut sawed bricks from the undisturbed prairie inside the nave, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, 30 inches long, each one weighing 40 to 50 pounds. She stacked them in a running bond pattern, each course offset from the one below, 2 feet thick. The sod went up course by course, slow, deliberate, heavy. 3 courses in the first day, 5 in the second as her hands found the rhythm. By the end of 10 days, the walls were 4 feet high and the cabin had begun to look like a thing that could hold heat. Her food stores were shrinking. She had eaten through a third of her provisions already. The weeks of labor required calories she had not fully calculated for. She ate 1 meal a day to conserve. She lost weight she did not have to lose. On the 22nd of October, the first frost arrived. Not a killing frost. Temperatures dropped to 28 degrees by midnight and climbed back above freezing by noon. But it was a warning, Clara counted forward. 6 weeks, maybe 7, before the serious cold set in. She had 4 courses of sod to go on the walls and the roof still to build. She worked faster. Her hands stopped hurting, which she understood meant the damage had gone deep enough that the nerves had stopped registering it. The roof took 5 days. Cottonwood rafters, then willow branches woven tight between them, then a double layer of sod cut thinner than the wall bricks, 3 inches each, then 6 inches of packed river clay mixed with dry grass. The total weight settled onto the walls gradually as she worked from one end to the other, and she held her breath the first night, listening for cracking or settling. The walls held. The sod compressed under the load and held tighter, not looser. She had one problem she had not solved, a stove. She had no stove. She had a fire pit scratched into the dirt floor and a smoke hole in the roof. A fire pit was not a stove. A fire pit heated the air above it and let most of the warmth go straight out the smoke hole. She needed iron. She had no money for iron. In the last week of October, a blacksmith in Ord named Gerhardt ran short on someone willing to clean his shop floor, haul cinders, and scrub the forge frame for 5 days without complaint. Clara did not complain. On the 5th day, Gerhardt brought out a dented cast-iron box stove with a cracked flue plate and set it in front of her. The crack ran 4 inches from the collar fitting and could be felt but not seen. He had been meaning to throw it out for a year. She traded 5 days' work for that stove and carried it the 5 miles back to the chapel in 2 trips. The stove body 1 trip and the cast-iron legs and flue sections the next. She patched the cracked plate with river clay mixed with wood ash, packing it tight and letting it cure for 3 days before she lit the first fire. The patch held. She installed the stove with its chimney pipe running up through the cabin roof and 2 feet above the sod surface, angled east to minimize downdraft from the northwest wind. She chinked every gap in the cabin walls with mud daub. She hung one of the buffalo hides over the door opening and stretched oiled paper across the single window opening. Glass was beyond her means at 10 cents per square foot. Then she did the thing that made her shelter different from any other structure in the Bethel settlement. She packed the air gap. Between her cabin walls and the limestone nave walls, there was a space 3 to 5 feet wide all the way around. She filled that gap with loose straw and dried grass, pushing it in tight from above until the gap from floor to the tops of her cabin walls was packed solid with dry insulation. On top of the straw, she laid a single course of sod to keep the wind from disturbing it. The dead air was gone, replaced by something better. Still air trapped in a million small pockets between dried grass stems, the same principle as a down blanket applied at scale. Then she built the sod wall. Where the chapel's original wooden doors had once hung, there was now an open gap in the limestone, 8 feet wide, 12 feet high, open to every wind that crossed the plains. Clara stacked sod bricks across the bottom 6 feet of that gap, leaving a narrow doorway on one side wide enough to pass through. She filled the upper section with bundled hay bales stacked tight, lashing them with twine. It was not permanent. It was enough. On the second day of November, with the temperature at 34 degrees and a northwest wind gusting to 25 miles per hour outside, she lit the stove for the first time. She held a candle near the gap between the door hide and the frame. The flame bent toward her, not away. No draw from outside. She held it near the window. The flame stood straight. She put her hand against the cabin wall, not limestone, sod, and felt the warmth the mud daub had trapped. The stove burned for 3 hours. She checked the temperature by feel every 30 minutes. Cold, cool, warmer, warm. When she banked the coals before sleeping, the cabin held at what she judged to be 40 degrees. Cold enough to see her breath, warm enough to sleep without shaking. Outside, the wind chill was 12 below zero. She lay in her blankets and listened to the wind hit the limestone and shear upward over the walls. Inside the nave, it dropped to a whisper. Inside the cabin, it was nothing at all. She had been right about the air. She had been right about the stone. But this was November. The hard months were January and February, when Nebraska temperatures could fall to 40 below zero and winds screamed at 60 miles per hour for days at a time. She had 2 cords of mixed fuel, hay twists, cow chips, cottonwood scraps, dried corn stalks she had scavenged from harvested fields. She had approximately 200 pounds of provisions, 80 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, foraged plums, and smoked rabbit. She had water from the river and a trap line set along the cottonwood grove. It was enough. Maybe, if nothing unexpected happened, if the winter was no worse than the previous one, if her roof held under the weight of deep snow, if the stove did not fail. She was short on food by 30% of what she needed for 6 months. She was short on fuel by an unknown margin. She could not know yet how much the shelter's efficiency would reduce her consumption. She was alone with no one to watch a fire while she slept, no one to help her if she was injured, no one who would check on her if she did not appear for a week. In late November, the first serious cold snap arrived. Temperatures fell to 5 below zero and stayed there for 3 days, the wind gusting to 35 miles per hour. Outside the stone walls, the wind chill hit 30 below. Clara's stove burned steadily. The cabin held at 38 degrees on low fire, climbing to 55 when she burned full. She used half the fuel Agnes Muller burned in the same period, and the difference was visible. Clara's fuel stack shrank slowly, while Agnes's depleted at double the rate. Agnes came by on a pretense, a stray cow she claimed to be looking for, though no one's cattle ran loose in November, and found Clara alive and the cabin warm and the fuel stack still substantial. She stood inside the nave and felt the still air around her. She pressed her hand against the limestone wall and held it there. She said nothing. She left. What she noticed, riding back to her sod house, was that the air inside the stone walls had been warmer than the air outside by at least 20 degrees, not from the stove, but from the wind's absence. And she began to think about the wall of cold coming in January, when Nebraska showed what it could really do. December brought temperatures between 10 and 20 below zero, regular and merciless. Clara rationed food to 1 meal a day, a cup of cornmeal mush in the morning, a small portion of beans and salt pork at night. She lost more weight. Her coat, already too large, hung off her shoulders. She trapped rabbit twice a week and stretched the meat across 3 days. She repaired a crack in the mud daub where the north sod wall had settled and refilled the gap before cold could penetrate it. She hauled water from the river through ice 4 inches thick. She survived December. The settlement watched from a distance and said nothing officially, but word moved the way it always moves in small communities, quietly from mouth to ear in the general store and after church on Sundays. The girl in the ruin was still alive. The girl in the ruin had heat and food. Nobody said she had been right. Nobody said they had been wrong. But the watching continued, and the quality of the silence was shifting from certainty of failure toward something more complicated. In the first week of January, a cold snap locked the region below zero for 6 consecutive days. Omaha, 150 miles to the east, recorded temperatures that barely rose above zero even at midday. Valley County was colder. Fuel supplies across Bethel fell sharply. Agnes Muller's sod house burned through a third of her remaining stores in those 6 days. 2 families burned furniture. Clara's fuel stack, she counted it on January 8th, held approximately 10 days' worth of careful burning. 10 days. It was January 8th. The hard cold of February was still 6 weeks away. She had pushed every calculation to its limit. She had gathered more fuel and stretched it further and burned less per hour than any conventional shelter on the plains could manage. And she was still 10 days from running out. She sat in her cabin on the night of January 8th with the stove banked low and the limestone walls holding quiet around her, and she did the math again, and the math said the same thing it had said the first time. She was short. On the night of January 11th, the temperature stood at 6 below zero, and Clara lay in her blankets with every covering she owned piled over her, and she listened to the wind hitting the limestone and thought about what she would burn after the fuel ran out. The hay in the nave door gap, the bench, the door frame, the sod bricks themselves, which would not burn but might be dismantled and piled against the interior walls for additional mass. She slept. In the morning, January 12th, she opened her door and the air hit her face like summer. 42 degrees. Sun sharp and warm above the open nave. The snow from the previous week was melting in patches on the nave floor. She stepped outside the stone walls into the full morning, and the wind was soft and southern, barely more than a breeze, carrying something almost sweet from the south. Across the settlement, doors she had not seen open in weeks were opening. Children ran into yards. Men walked without their coats. A bird sang somewhere along the river. Clara stood in the warm morning, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Her father had told her about days like this. The prairie could warm and soften before a cold front, the way an ocean calmed before a hurricane. The warmth was not a gift. The warmth was a signal. She looked northwest. The sky there was the color of a slate board, flat and dark, moving toward her faster than clouds should move. She went back inside the stone walls and she began packing every gap, tightening every lashing, driving additional mud daub into every joint she could reach. She worked through noon. She worked through early afternoon. At 2 o'clock, the temperature had fallen to 20 degrees. At 2:30, it was 12. The sky to the northwest was no longer the color of slate. It was black, and it was moving, and it was making a sound she had never heard the sky make before. She was inside the cabin with the stove burning full and the door tied shut when the storm hit the limestone walls like a freight train. The sound was not wind. Clara had heard wind her entire life. The low moan through grass, the sharp whistle between fence posts, the sustained roar of a plains gale pressing against sod walls. This was none of those things. This was the sound of something moving faster than the land could absorb, a continuous percussion of ice particles hitting limestone at 60 miles per hour, a note below the range of ordinary weather. The walls took it. She stood inside her cabin with her hand on the stove's iron surface and felt the metal warm against her palm and listened to the storm assault the outside of the chapel, and she felt for the first time what the stone actually did. Not insulate, not warm, simply stop. Everything the wind carried, the ice, the driving cold, the structural force of 60-mile-per-hour air, stopped at the limestone and did not continue. Inside the nave, the air moved sluggishly, barely a draft. Inside the cabin, nothing. The candle on the single shelf burned straight and still. She added fuel. She waited. The temperature outside the stone walls fell through 0 in the first hour. This had been true across Valley County since the morning. A normal January cold snap, miserable but manageable. Then the front hit. At 2:47 in the afternoon, by the account of a farmer 7 miles south near Ord, who had a pocket watch and the presence of mind to check it, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 4 minutes. In the hour that followed, it dropped another 30. By nightfall, it was 32 below 0 in the open, and the wind was still at 60 miles per hour, and the combination of the two produced a wind chill that no instrument in Valley County could accurately measure, but that experienced men, later, would estimate at 70 to 100 below 0 Q, cold enough to freeze bare skin in under a minute, cold enough to kill cattle standing in open fields before they understood they were dying. The settlement of Bethel was not built for this. Most of the buildings in Bethel were frame construction. Pine-board walls with tar paper tacked over the gaps, raised on shallow foundations, roofed with hand-split shingles over thin rafters. They had been adequate for every previous winter the settlement had experienced. They were not adequate for this one. The wind at 60 miles per hour did not merely chill a frame building. It used every gap, every badly fitted door, every unsealed window joint as an entry point, driving ice particles fine as sifted flour through cracks no thicker than a knife blade and depositing them in drifts on interior floors. Inside Deacon Voss's general store, the front window, single-pane glass, 4 years old, already showing a hairline crack in one corner, shattered at 3:15. The tar paper overhang above it peeled away in one motion, like a page turned by a hand. Snow drove through the opening in a horizontal sheet. Voss had been behind the counter. He packed flour sacks against the opening and nailed boards over them, and it helped for 20 minutes until the boards blew in. By 4 o'clock, his store was 14 degrees inside and falling. His frame house attached to the back of the store was in the same condition. He and his wife moved everything they could carry into the root cellar beneath the store floor and pulled the hatch down over them and listened to the building above them bend and flex in the wind. Agnes Muller's sod house held better. The sod walls, 2 feet thick, dense, and compressed from 7 years of settling, resisted the wind in ways the frame buildings could not. But sod walls had a different weakness. Her roof was made the same way every frontier sod roof was made: cottonwood rafters, willow branches, sod, packed earth, and prayer. It had absorbed the weight of every winter snowfall for 7 years. By this January, it was carrying the weight of December's 2-foot accumulation, plus the new snow driving in from above, compacting and dense. Sometime near 5 o'clock, she could not tell exactly. The storm had turned noon to midnight, and time had dissolved into the next load to carry and the next crack to hear. A beam in the center of her roof gave a sound like a rifle shot and dropped 2 inches. Her 2 children were asleep on the floor beneath it. She moved them against the far wall and stood with a timber propped under the beam and listened to the roof settle around her and felt the temperature inside her house fall toward 20 degrees as the wind drove through the gap that had opened at the ceiling joint. She stood there for a long time, propping the beam, watching her children sleep, calculating whether the roof would hold until morning. At 9 o'clock, she made her decision. She dressed her children in everything they owned: 2 coats each, stockings over stockings, scarves wrapped until only their eyes showed. She tied a rope around her own waist, and the other end around her older child's waist, and the other end of that around the younger one's. She opened her door into a wall of sound and cold so absolute it was almost physical, a solid thing she pushed herself into rather than walked into, and she turned northwest, toward the high bluff and the limestone walls she had been thinking about since November. She could not see. She moved by memory. She knew the ground between her sod house and the chapel ruin, the way she knew her own hands. Every slope, every fence line, every place where the ground dipped toward the river. She moved with her head down and one arm in front of her face and pulled her children forward with the rope. 400 yards. It took 40 minutes. Clara heard the pounding at 9:43. She knew it was a person because the rhythm was irregular, not the even percussion of the storm against stone, but something arrhythmic and desperate, a fist against the sod wall she had built across the nave entrance. She opened the door into the storm. Agnes Muller stood in the gap of the chapel entrance, both children pressed against her sides, all three of them coated in ice from their eyebrows to their boots, the rope still connecting them in a line. Agnes's face was white where it was not red, and the tears on her cheeks had frozen before they could fall and made thin lines of ice from her eyes to her jaw. She said, "My roof." Clara pulled them inside. She stripped ice from the children's coats and set them against the stove and fed the fire up to full and watched the ice melt into puddles on the dirt floor, and the children stopped shaking. Agnes stood in the middle of the cabin with her arms at her sides and looked at the candle burning straight and said nothing for a long time. She said, "The air is still." "Yes," Clara said. Agnes looked at the limestone walls visible through the cabin window, gray in the darkness. She looked at the stove. She looked at the candle. She said, "How warm is it?" 42 degrees now. I can get it to 55 with the fire full." Outside, the temperature stood at 32 below zero. The wind was still at 60 miles per hour. The differential between outside the stone walls and inside Clara's cabin was, at that moment, nearly 90 degrees. Agnes sat down on the floor next to her children. She did not speak again for an hour. The school teacher arrived at midnight. Her name was Martha Hogue, and she was 23 years old and had been teaching the 7 children of Bethel's families in the one-room frame schoolhouse since September. She had kept the children in when the storm hit. The right decision, the decision that saved lives across the plains that day, as teacher after teacher made the same call rather than sending children into the white nothing outside. She had burned every piece of available fuel by 9 o'clock, and then burned the spare benches and then the bookshelves. At 11, the door blew open for the 3rd time and could not be rehung against the force of the wind. Snow drove through the opening in a column, and the interior temperature fell toward 0. She found a coil of rope in the storage closet. She tied it to the door frame and walked it to the fence post at the school's edge, then hand over hand to the next post, then the next. She had 7 children. She tied them together the same way Agnes had tied her own, and she walked them along the fence line, post by post, 200 yards through absolute blindness and impossible cold, toward the only thing on the bluff that she knew would still be standing. The limestone walls. She had seen them every day for 4 months from the schoolhouse window. She had thought about them the way everyone in Bethel had thought about them, as a curiosity, a ruin, the place where the strange Engel girl had gone to die in a different way than expected. Now she thought about them the way a drowning person thinks about a distant shore. Clara heard the rope knock on the nave wall. 3 pulls, the signal teachers used, ears, before she heard voices. She opened the nave entrance and counted children in the dark. 7, plus the teacher. She pulled them inside. The cabin held 10 people now. It was built for 1. Clara moved her provisions against the far wall and spread her blankets and the 2 buffalo hides on the floor. She put the children against the stove, 3 deep, and told them to stay still and share the warmth. She fed the fire. She looked at her fuel stack. 9 days remaining if she was alone, burning carefully. With 10 people generating body heat, she could reduce the stove output. But 10 people also needed to eat, and she had provisions for 1. She counted the flour. She counted the salt pork. She counted the dried beans. She divided by 10 and kept the number to herself. Deacon Karl Voss arrived near dawn. He came alone. His wife had refused to leave the root cellar, and he had left her there with blankets and a candle, and the promise he would come back for her once he knew there was somewhere to go. He had spent 3 hours in the dark below his destroyed store calculating options, and when dawn came without bringing warmth, the temperature had not risen above 30 below, and the wind had not dropped. He had only one option left. He climbed out of the root cellar into a building that had no windows and one wall. He crossed the settlement toward the bluff. He did not have a rope. He navigated by the angle of the wind and by the shape of the land under his boots, the slight rise toward the river, the feeling of the ground tilting upward. He fell twice. He got up both times. He reached the chapel entrance and pushed through the sod wall gap, and stood inside the nave and felt the wind stop and the air change around him, and he stood there for a full minute before he went any further. He had never been inside the walls. He had looked at them for 2 years as a source of building material. He had thought about them as stone, weight, volume, dollar value per cubic foot. He had never stood inside them and felt what Clara Engel had felt on a September afternoon when she walked through the gap and her hair stopped moving. The air was still. Compared to the open prairie, the nave was almost warm. He pushed through the cabin door. 14 people looked back at him from a room the size of a large pantry. Agnes Mueller and her 2 children, Martha Hoag and 7 students, Tobias Rademacher, who had arrived alone sometime before midnight and who now sat with his back against the cabin's north wall, and Clara. The stove burned at low ember. Everyone was above freezing. No one had frostbite. No one had died. Voss looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him and said nothing. He sat down on the floor against the east wall, pulled his coat tighter, and said nothing either. The storm burned for 16 hours at full intensity. Between 2 o'clock in the afternoon of January 12th and 6 o'clock in the morning of January 13th, the wind did not drop below 40 miles per hour, and the temperature did not rise above 30 below zero in the open. By 6 in the morning, the wind began to lessen, 40, then 30, then a sustained 25 that felt, after what had preceded it, like ordinary weather. Clara's stove had burned through 2/3 of her remaining fuel. She had fed 14 people 1 meal each. A cup of thin cornmeal, mush per person, all the beans she had left simmered together in her single large pot, passed around the room in the pot itself, because she had only 2 cups and 1 bowl. No one complained. The children slept in shifts against the stove. The adults sat against the walls with their knees drawn up and their coats buttoned to the throat and listened to the storm diminish. At 7 in the morning, Clara opened the nave entrance. The world outside the stone walls was unrecognizable. 5-foot drifts had buried the lower portions of the limestone walls on the north and west faces, rounding the chapel's hard angles into smooth curves. The settlement below was visible only as interruptions in the white scene, irregular humps where buildings had been. Some of them changed in shape, some of them collapsed. The sky was clear and brutally cold, a blue so pale it was nearly white, with the sun already rising and doing nothing at all for the temperature, which stood at 25 below zero in still air. No wind. In the still cold, 14 people emerged from the chapel entrance into the morning and looked at what remained. The schoolhouse stood but was unusable, door gone, interior packed with snow. Voss's store had lost its front face and most of its roof. 2 frame houses on the settlement's south end had lost their roofs entirely. One had a collapsed west wall. Agnes Muller's sod house was intact below the roof line, but the center beam had failed completely overnight, and the roof had dropped 18 inches in the middle, rendering the interior impassable. The stone walls of the Calvary Mission Chapel were unchanged, not a shifted block, not a widened crack. The limestone that had been laid by hand in 1873 had stood through the worst storm in the recorded history of the Central Plains and was standing still. Clara stood beside the nave entrance and looked at the settlement below and thought about 10 days of fuel and 14 people. The calculation was the same one it had always been. She was short, but she had been short since August, and she was still alive. She went back inside and stoked the stove. On January 14th, Reverend Heinrich Brandt arrived at the chapel. He had ridden from his own undamaged sod house, thick-walled and well-built. He had survived the storm without serious damage, and he came not on foot but on horseback, which meant he had come with intention and not merely desperation. He dismounted at the chapel entrance and stood looking at the walls for a long time before he went through. Inside the nave, several of the settlement's families had begun the process Clara had expected, salvaging timber and sod from the damaged buildings and erecting rough lean-tos against the interior walls of the nave, using the same principle Clara had used, the stone as shield, the improvised inner construction as the insulator. 3 families were already at work. 2 more were carrying materials up from the settlement below. Brandt walked through the nave and through the cabin door. Clara was inside. She was cooking thin porridge, the last of her flour, enough for 20 people at reduced portions. Brandt stood in the doorway of the cabin he had predicted would be her coffin and looked at the stove she had bartered 5 days of labor to acquire, and the sod walls she had built alone, and the limestone visible through the cabin window, and the 14 people his settlement owed their survival to. He removed his hat. He turned to face the people crowded into the nave, not to Clara specifically, but to all of them, the way a man speaks when he knows the words are for everyone. And he said, "I was wrong." 3 words. He did not elaborate. On the frontier, those 3 words from Heinrich Brandt, 14 winters, 11 graves, the man who had never yet been wrong about what this land would do, cost more than a sermon. Agnes Muller was standing behind Clara. She said to Brandt, "Tell her what the walls did." Brandt looked at the limestone. He said, "The wind couldn't reach her." "That's half of it," Agnes said. She turned to Clara. "Tell him the other half." Clara ladled porridge into cups and distributed them before she answered. Then she said, "The cabin is the insulation. The stone is the shield. The gap between them is the buffer. You need all 3. She paused. "My father knew limestone holds heat. I knew wind kills faster than cold. That's all I did." Brandt put his hat back on. He looked at the walls one more time. Then he went outside and began helping carry salvaged timber up from the settlement. Agnes sat down beside Clara on the cabin floor, the first time anyone from Bethel had sat beside Clara as an equal since August. She said, "I want to understand it, properly. Not just that it worked. Why it worked," Clara told her. She described what her father had told her about thermal mass, the way stone absorbed and held heat the way a cast iron pan held heat, releasing it slowly long after the source was gone. He described the wind reduction, solid walls reducing 60-mile-per-hour gales to near nothing on the protected side, the way a windbreak of trees worked but faster and harder because stone was impermeable where trees were not. She described the dead air gap packed with straw, still air as insulation, the principle behind every down blanket and hay-stuffed wall in every pioneer dwelling on the plains, just applied in a different place. Agnes listened to all of it. Then she said, "I burned twice your fuel in November, and we both held 40 degrees. "Yes." "And my roof failed." "Yes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to build against your north wall," she said, "when it's safe to move materials." Clara nodded. "The east section gets the most sun." Deacon Voss never apologized. He was not built for it, and no one expected it, but he abandoned his petition to salvage the limestone. He did not announce this. He simply stopped filing paperwork, and when the county land office sent a follow-up inquiry in March of 1888, he did not respond. The congregation that had expelled Clara Engel for her lack of faith spent the remainder of January and all of February in the structure she had built. They slept against its walls. They cooked over its fires. They healed their frostbitten hands in its relative warmth. None of them said, formally or officially, that they had been wrong. That was not how such things were said in those communities. But in the spring, when the settlement began rebuilding, the new schoolhouse was built differently. Thick walls, smaller interior volume, and the site chosen with a hillside to the northwest, acting as a partial windbreak. It was not exactly what Clara had done, but it came from the same understanding, that the wind was the first enemy, and the cold came after. By the spring of 1888, 4 other families in Valley County had heard about the structure in the chapel ruins and sent someone to look at it. All 4 went back and applied some version of the principle to their own rebuilding: inner walls, outer walls, a buffer between. None of them called it anything. It was just the way you built if you were thinking about what the wind could do. Clara taught all of them who asked. She did not charge. She did not hold knowledge back. Her father had given it to her without condition, and she passed it the same way. Clara Engel proved up her homestead claim in October of 1892, 5 years after she filed it. 160 acres, including the bluff, the river bottom Cottonwood Grove, and the Calvary Mission Chapel. She received the patent deed from the General Land Office and folded it once and put it in the tin box with her mother's savings book, which was empty, and her father's stonemason's hammer, which was not. She taught school at the rebuilt Bethel Schoolhouse from 1889 through 1902 at $25 a month. The congregation that expelled her for her lack of faith paid her salary every month for 14 years without formal acknowledgement of what that meant. She did not require the acknowledgement. She taught their children to read and decipher, and when winter came and the wind pushed against the building, to understand why the school had been built the way it had been built. She lived inside the stone walls until 1903, when she moved to Lincoln. She was 35 years old. She left the cabin standing. She did not strip it for materials. She did not explain why. When people asked about her faith, in Lincoln, she was known to say, "I believe in limestone." She did not say it as a joke. On January 12, 1889, 1 year to the day after the school children's blizzard, the Bethel settlement held a remembrance service. They held it inside the Calvary Mission Chapel, not inside the rebuilt church on the settlement's south end, which had been framed and roofed the previous summer with proper milled lumber and an iron stove and good windows. Not in someone's home. Inside the ruin. Inside the roofless limestone walls that had stood on that bluff since 1873, that had been abandoned and burned and left to the grass and the weather, and finally to a 19-year-old girl who had been told they were worthless to anyone still living. Reverend Brandt led the service. He stood in the nave with the January sky open above him and the temperature below zero, and the congregation gathered in coats and scarves, and he said toward the end what he had said on January 14th. "I was wrong." He said it more slowly this time. Clara was not there. She was inside her cabin, which was warm. The final image of the Bethel settlement's remembrance, recorded in a single line in the Valley County Advocate the following week, was this: the congregation standing in the open nave in below zero air, the wind that day, 10 miles per hour, mild for January, once, dropping to nothing inside the walls, the breath of 30 people rising in small clouds above their heads and out through the roofless nave into the clear prairie sky. Still air, warm stone, the walls holding. Exactly what Reverend Heinrich Brandt who had survived 14 Nebraska winters and buried 11 of his parishioners, had told Clara Engel would never work.